Greetings, my fellow traditionalist Catholics. This is Sergio Becerra II. Welcome back to my channel. So in this video, I wanted to talk about, which was covered by Brother Peter Diamond on the YouTube channel Vatican Catholic, about the first female, quote-unquote, Archbishop of Canterbury in the United Kingdom, Sarah Moali, who back in April had a private audience with anti-Pope Leo XIV. So I left a comment in his video talk about the very last true Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. That would be Cardinal Reginald Pole in the mid 16th century. So I want to talk about Cardinal Reginald Pole, and then of course the second part of this video is talking about women within the church, which I will be focusing on Moali's quote-unquote election as quote-unquote Archbishop of the heretical Anglican Church. So Cardinal Reginald Pole, born in March 1500, many years later, was later made a cardinal under Pope Paul III, because apparently during the reign of King Henry VIII, when he couldn't get a divorce from Pope Clement VII, this kind of forced Henry to move away from Rome and the Catholic Church, start his own church that would be the heretical Anglican Church, in order to have his marriage declared null and void by an Archbishop of Canterbury of his own. That would be Thomas Cranmer, who put an end to Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order for him to marry Anne Boleyn in the hopes of gaining a male heir. By that, around the same time, the German Reformation in Germany by the heretic Martin Luther was already in full swing at the time. And now here's the background about Reginald Pole. His mother is the Blessed Margaret Plantagenet Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who ended up being executed for treason along with Cardinal Pole's brother Henry Montague Pole. Now, as I just said, Margaret Pole's middle name is Plantagenet. That means that the Pole family are the last living descendants of the previous English dynasty. That would be the Plantagenets. In fact, Reginald Pole is actually the let me look it up on my phone again. I'm sorry. I know he's related to two kings of that same dynasty. Let me look it up. Okay. He is actually the great nephew of the last two Plantagenet kings, Edward IV and Richard III, and he's also the great grandson of Richard Neville, who was the Earl of Warwick, who in fact was friends with Edward IV, in which Edward himself took down for his betrayal, because Warwick at one time was the kingmaker that put Edward on the throne, but then things started getting out of hand between the two. So once Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, snatched the throne from Richard III, becoming the first Tudor king, the Plantagenets were now officially out of power. They still had nobility, but no longer had the throne, but still had claim to it, which they've had since Henry II in the middle of the 12th century. So the Poles had a legitimate claim to the throne, and the thing with Reginald Pole, he could have been made a possible candidate to become king. But apparently, since the um, Pilgrimage of Grace, which was the pro-Catholic rebellion against Henry VIII, had started during his third marriage to Jane Seymour, the Poles were accused of treason, siding with the Pilgrimage of Grace in order to have Henry restore the monasteries, which were destroyed and suppressed by Thomas Cromwell, who later fell from grace and out of Henry's favor. Pole apparently went into exile because he did not agree to the annulment of Henry and Catherine of Aragon. Apparently, he went into exile in Rome under the protection of Pope Paul III, and then was still under the protection of the papacy during the pontificate of Pope Julius III. Henry, in fact, was excommunicated by Paul III, not only for breaking allegiance from Rome, but also taking down the Pilgrimage of Grace, and then, of course, Cardinal Pole's mother and brother were later executed for treason, for siding with the rebellion that tried to get rid of him, attempted to get rid of him, if the monasteries were not restored, because they were not happy with the English Reformation that had started, which was trying to put an end to Catholicism within England. So, but even by the time Henry VIII died, Edward VI, which was Henry VIII's youngest child and only son, took the throne, which his reign only lasted 6 years. Pole was still in Rome, still under the protection of Julius III. It wouldn't be until Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Queen Mary I, became the first English queen of the entire country of England to restore Catholicism back into England. So once word reached Rome, this kind of put excitement to both Pope Julius III and Cardinal Pole. Now, here's the thing about Cardinal Pole. After the death of Paul III, he was actually a possible candidate for the papacy and only needed 2 votes in order to win the conclave, which in fact Julius III won. So he only needed 2 votes, 26 out of 28, in order to win the conclave at the time. So he still remained in exile under protection at the time of Julius III. Once Mary I became queen, and then marrying Philip II of Spain, Mary I apparently deposed and deprived Thomas Cranmer, the Anglican quote-unquote archbishop, and put him to death for annulling the marriage between her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and Henry VIII. So once Pole was aware of what had happened, Julius III made him the new Archbishop of Canterbury and papal legate to England. So once everything was settled in, Catholicism in England was restored. And once Julius III died in 1555 and was later succeeded by Paul III, there were disputes between Cardinal Pole and Paul IV. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was that when Cardinal Pole was made a possible candidate for the papacy, the cardinals, in fact, kind of accused him of being a I guess you could say, a crypto-Lutheran. But there were accusations by Rome that instead of being harsh on Protestants, both the Anglicans and Lutherans in England, Pope Paul IV kind of accused him of being lenient with with the Protestants and not suppressing and putting into them for heresy. In fact, Cardinal Pole's health was already in decline before his death in 1557. So Pole would actually be the very last true Archbishop of Canterbury in England. And since then, there hasn't been. You have had nothing but usurpers to the See of Canterbury, which are the quote unquote archbishops in the Anglican Church. And there hasn't been one since. Now the next part is women within the church. Well, the Anglican Church to be exact. As I have said, Anti-Pope Leo XIV had an audience with Sarah Mullally, who was the first female quote-unquote Archbishop of Canterbury. And here's the things that gets really infuriating, which I find to be infuriating, which was covered by Brother Peter Diamond in his last video some weeks ago. That Mullally, in fact, did a blessing within the Clementine Chapel in St. Peter's. The Clementine Chapel is located within the Vatican grottos, which is the place where most of the popes are buried within St. Peter's. In fact, the Clementine Chapel is like the oldest chapel in St. Peter's, dating all the way back to the old St. Peter's Basilica that was built in the 4th century AD. The thing about Mullally is that she's a big-time heretic, no doubt extremely liberal, and of course woke. Apparently is pro-sodomy, pro-abortion, and pro-open borders. And there is no doubt has disregarded the Bible by all means. Now, this lays out a question with Mullally. So what I'm going to do is, let me look up on my phone here. Let me see. Okay. I'm looking up. If I'm looking up correctly, I think her predecessor was the one who did the coordination on I think her quote unquote predecessor goes by the name I have right here, Justin Wilby. I think he was the one responsible for King Charles III's coordination. But he did in fact do the funeral for Queen Elizabeth II. Yes, here it is. I found it. Okay, so Mullally's predecessor, that would be Justin Wilby, who is the previous quote-unquote Archbishop of Canterbury. As I just found right now, I apologize, I should have been ahead of all this, carried out the coronation of King Charles III, and then, of course, as I just said, carried out the funeral for Queen Elizabeth II. Now, my question is this: when having the first female quote-unquote Archbishop of the Anglican Church, it makes me question whether once King Charles dies and is later succeeded by his eldest son, Prince William, will William's reign even be considered legitimate because you now have a woman within that position? And here's the thing about Mullally. This kind of goes against and in violation of the Bible itself, because the New Testament kind of makes it clear about women preaching in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 and 12, which simply states a woman can learn from the Gospels, just can't preach them. So, and since the Anglican Church is not the real Catholic Church, which is like been done away with for a long time in England, but it still makes me question further, not just with England, but other Protestant nations and their monarchies, which some still exist, like Denmark, that went Protestant. Are their monarchs and are their monarchs considered legitimate by having a Protestant archbishop carrying out the coordinations? The same thing with England, by having an Anglican archbishop carrying out the coordinations. Would that make their coordinations as kings and queens even legitimate? Because in my mind, personally, I don't think so. And then, of course, but most of them have been carried out by men, but Mullally is the first female to hold that position. So it makes me question whether or not William's I'm sorry, William's ascension to the throne will be made legitimate if Mullally carries out the coronation, putting the crown on his head. That includes Kate Middleton's legitimacy as queen as well. But for King Charles, since Mullally's predecessor, Justin Welby, was the last quote unquote archbishop, it makes me now wonder if Charles's uh, legitimacy to the throne is even real and legitimate. Because I did cover in a previous video with anti-Pope Leo XIV having a meeting with Charles, having special prayers within the Sistine Chapel, because Charles III has been under fire for siding with the sectarian forces of Islam and not with the Christians, both Protestant and Catholics in the UK. And since he holds the titles Defender of the Faith, Head of the Anglican Church of England, and is King, I think those would forfeit automatically. William, on the other hand, who is a Protestant heretic, now, from what I've been hearing, he's kind of somewhat sided with Islamists, because there's a quote he said, all faiths can learn from Islam. Well, what can all faiths learn from Islam, including Christians? Because there's nothing peaceful about them. There never has been, never will be. And of course, between Muslims and others, they'll say Islam is peaceful, which of course isn't. Because I've covered video after video talking about Islam and the threats it holds, especially within Islamic terrorism. Excuse me. But with Mullally's so-called election to that position, the See of Canterbury is still vacant. We don't have a Catholic archbishop in that position. It's just being usurped by one Protestant archbishop for many years. I mean, for many centuries. Not only am I questioning Charles's legitimacy to the throne, and along with William, soon to be, this also questions Queen Elizabeth II's reign as queen, if it's also legitimate, including every Protestant monarch within England. And to me personally, I don't think they are. Even with Mullally in position in that archbishopric see, I think the same. I think William's reign won't be legitimate either with the woman in charge. And as I had mentioned from 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 to 12, a woman cannot preach, so that's a violation of the Bible. And no doubt, Malloy has never taken the Bible seriously even once. So I find it hard to believe that William's soon-to-be ascension will be legitimate. And and even I believe that the legitimacy of all English monarchs, because Henry VIII was the last Catholic king before he decided to go heretic with the Anglican Church. Therefore, the reigns from Edward VI and then with Elizabeth I all the way are all illegitimate. However, James II of England was the last Catholic king to rule England, because when the Stuart dynasty went into exile after the death of Charles I, James II was like really fascinated with all Catholicism. So history was hard on James II, as far as I can say, which kind of like forced James to ditch the throne. But I'm personally believing that every Protestant monarch within England and even some Protestant monarchies in Europe, I don't believe their reigns are even considered legitimate, because they've all ditched Catholicism in general. So there is no Catholic Archbishop in Canterbury. The See of Canterbury is vacant, and all we have are Protestant usurpers. That's all. So this covers this video, talking about the very last true Archbishop of Canterbury, Reginald Pole, and now with Mullally. And I personally believe all the legitimate reigns of the English monarchy, which are all Protestant, are not legitimate. That would mean Charles III's reign is illegitimate, if I'm right. That would also mean the same with William once he ascends. So that makes me question a lot. So tell me what you think in the comments below. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell for future updates. All right, this takes care of this video, and hope to see you soon. Take care now. Bye.